First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Hello everyone, this is Fox 12 Now. I'm Greg Nibbler. Thank you for joining us. We are live streaming here from the Fox 12 Oregon newsroom. I always like to remind everybody of that because we do this every day from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Cover a wide range of topics on here. But right now, we're talking about, well, you can see it there on the screen, Jaws. June 20th, 1975 is when Jaws first was released. So the 50-year anniversary of Jaws is upon us. And even before that, on June 10th, is a documentary, Jaws at 50, that goes behind the scenes of how this movie was made, but really talking about the effects that it had on so many people. It's this documentary's got all kinds of different directors in there discussing it. Quentin Tarantino thinks that Jaws is the greatest movie ever made. So that just shows what effect it had on that. But also it had an effect on just the general public persona of sharks, or the public thoughts rather, of sharks in general, whether you were scared of them, whether you found them interesting. It had an effect on so many different people, and in particular, oceanographers, film producers, directors, and people who are out there actually photographing and filming sharks. And we talked to one of those gentlemen who has really been doing this for decades, Brian Skerry, and a really interesting interview, just finding out more about how much of an effect this movie had on him and the entire industry that he's in, and really what it's done to bring awareness to sharks and the ocean in general in so many different ways. So we got to sit down and talk to Brian for a bit about this, about the movie, about his industry and all of that, and that's what we're going to play for you here right now. In just 1 second. Well, Brian, thank you, for having time to talk to us about this. I mean, such a monumentous occasion here when we're talking about Jaws at 50 years old. And I want to get into that specific side of it. But before we do that, would you mind just letting everybody know, just about your career? Because, I mean, I think that's fascinating on its own, but also a good way to get into talking about this. Would you mind letting people know just, how you relate to Jaws, I guess, in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great question. And I have to credit Jaws for being very instrumental, I think, in my career in many ways. I grew up in a little town in Massachusetts, which is a coastal state, but I didn't live on the ocean. But my parents used to take me to the beaches in the summertime of Cape Cod and different places throughout New England beaches. And I fell in love with the sea as a child. And I think I always had an affinity for it, but I remember very vividly on opening night of Jaws, in June of 1975, I was in the theater. I had read the book. I had read Peter Benchley's book and was fascinated by the idea of sharks and so forth. And I went to see the movie and was absolutely blown away. I think I was a kid that always loved nature and animals and so forth. I had stacks of books about sharks and whales and diving and so forth. But I didn't know anybody in my little town that did have that same sort of passion. And now, here's this blockbuster summer movie with one of the lead characters, a hero, Matt Hooper, the Dreyfus character, who made science cool, who made, studying sharks really fascinating. He was the guy that people needed to go to get answers and to solve this, problem. And I think it made me go into the water even more than I had previously wanted to. And I was probably one of a small group of people that actually went into the water after seeing Jaws. But, it was 2 years after that, I became a certified scuba diver. And instead of pursuing science, I pursued visual art. So I've been a National Geographic magazine photographer for over 27 years, also a filmmaker doing documentary films about sharks and whales and so forth, trying to understand the science. But to this day, I still, can never go on a boat without quoting a line from Jaws, or, whether it's Quint or Brody or Hooper. So I even named my dog. I have a chocolate lab who goes with me on the ocean now and then, and I named him Hooper. So, yeah.
So, I mean, that's amazing, the kind of influence that it had on you, but that is the exact opposite, I would think, for probably the majority of people who didn't see Jaws and think, oh yeah, I want to get into the ocean now and go film sharks. Yep. To that side of things. Well, for you and and people in your line of work, you know, nature, photography, documentaries, you know, films. Is that kind of the same thing? Does that resonate with so many different people? Is that Jaws actually made you want to get into the ocean?
Yes. You know, I think that Jaws actually spawned a generation of new marine scientists, many who pursued studying sharks, like the Hooper character, but others who pursued other things. I mean, in fact, I have a lot of colleagues, you know, who are in their maybe late 60s or even early 70s or in somewhere in that age range that you know, have beards and wear glasses and denim jackets, just like Hooper did in Jaws. I think that they were inspired by that character. As I said, you know, Hooper in that film was a scientist, so he was a researcher. He was a brainy kind of guy that knew the facts and figures and statistics. But he wasn't only doing these things in a lab. He was out diving. You know, he was with sharks. He was in shark cages. He was traveling around the world. He made science, I think, cool and fascinating and interesting. And I do believe that there's a lot of people out there in the sciences, marine biology, ichthyology, that could probably point to that film as a, you know, inspiration. But, you know, I think it was a component as well, Greg, of a larger narrative. You know, this was a story that was a classic ocean tale. It was like Moby Dick or other great yarns about the sea. You had the old salty fisherman, a war veteran who had this great knowledge in a different way about sharks and about time on the ocean. You had the police chief. The script was really compelling, written by Peter Benchley and other writers who came in. You know, obviously Steven Spielberg's brilliant direction, you know, building on the suspense. So, you know, many directors, many film people have called it a perfect movie. So I think, you know, had it not been such a great film, maybe that Hooper character wouldn't have been quite as compelling, but it was really a wonderful film and a wonderful movie. Now, you know, I can also acknowledge that as a result of Jaws, you know, sharks became persecuted. You know, a lot of people went out and wanted to kill sharks. They wanted to sort of emulate the Quint character and go out and kill sharks. And that certainly, I don't believe, was the intention. I got to know Peter Benchley, who wrote the book and the script for the movie. And, you know, I spent a month with him diving in Cuba 25 years ago before his death. And, you know, he spoke to how he never could have imagined that would happen. And he actually spent the rest of his life before he passed, and his wife, Wendy, who still continues this work today, in shark conservation, trying to help people understand that sharks play a vital role to the health of the oceans and our ocean planet. So both things can be true. You know, you can have a great movie that's compelling, but, you know, there was an unintended bad consequence as a result.
Which is, yeah, anytime I would imagine, you know, you put something out like that, you never know what that audience reaction is going to be and how people will take things. But I think, you know, looking at that positive side, I think that's amazing that your colleagues are wearing the denim jackets with the beards, and because that's the cool person that helped influence them, you know, Hooper.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's amazing. That just shows the power of that. I mean, when you look to the general public, you know, you touched on that a little bit, but even now, what is it, do you think, about Jaws and about, you know, sharks and honestly what you do too, you know, going there into the sea and filming these things that most 99.9% of the people aren't ever going to really see? But what do you think it is that draws people in when you talk about things like Jaws and sharks and the ocean?
Well, I think, you know, it might have been Benchley who said that, you know, human beings need their mysteries. They need their monsters. You know, they need the things that really intrigue them. And I think with sharks and animals in the ocean, for me anyway, there's always a sense of the potential for discovery. You know, the ocean, even though we are terrestrial creatures and we often see our world from that terrestrial centric viewpoint, we very much live on an ocean world, an ocean planet. You know, not only is about 72% of Earth's surface ocean and water, but 98% of Earth's biosphere, 98% of the livable, habitable planet where life can exist is ocean. And yet about 90 or 95% of it remains unexplored. So it's a great place to make discoveries, to understand what's going on. Every other breath that a human being takes comes from the ocean. It is the greatest carbon sink on this planet. It takes in carbon and gives us back oxygen. And yet, we've done a lot of damage to the oceans over the last 50 or 60 years, 100 years with, taking 100 million sharks out of the ocean every year. We've lost half the world's coral reefs. We dump 18 billion pounds of plastic into the ocean every year. So, I think for those of us, for me, I can speak for myself, I was inspired to go into the ocean to be close to animals, to understand these enigmatic creatures like sharks or whales or other ecosystems below polar ice, for example. But along the way, I saw that, the oceans are suffering from a lot of problems. And as a journalist, I felt a sense of urgency and responsible to turn my cameras towards those things as well, to celebrate the beauty, but also show the problems and solutions. So that's been a bit of a narrative evolution, I guess, in my own work.
Yeah, and showing both sides of that and both aspects of that. But I love that, that discovery, that's, the unknown, which Jaws still has that. I mean, it's there beneath the surface. You see these giant jaws, pop up.
I can tell you, Greg, that I remember I saw my first shark in the wild, in the ocean, in 1982. So that was just 7 years after Jaws came out. And I was in New England. I was off the coast of Rhode Island with a group of marine biologists that had invited me to go out. I, was in heaven. It was a little homemade shark cage that this guy had built. And we went, 20 or 25 miles offshore. We put the cage in the water. Visibility wasn't great. And I remember being in that cage on and off for about 3 or 4 hours, maybe that day, before I saw the first shark. And I was in the cage alone. It was in the afternoon, and in the sort of murky green water, I saw this female blue shark. She was about maybe 8 feet long, swimming along the chum slick and getting closer, but not quite close enough. And I remember opening the door of the shark cage and swimming out. And they told me later I was the first to ever do that among their group. But, again, in my mind, I was a little bit thinking about Jaws, and I was afraid. But on the other hand, I think my sense of wanting to be close to that animal, to get closer and to experience it personally, overcame any fears that I might have had. And she didn't look threatening. She wasn't, aggressive in any way. I wrote about this in one of my books called Shark, where I said, I think she reminded me of a wanderer on like an ancient journey, and I was just a momentary distraction. But for me, having that encounter, that sense of my own personal discovery, ignited a flame that, 40 years later, I'm still burning inside with. I'll be out photographing sharks next week.
Wow. I mean, I'm amazed. I'm grateful that you're able to go out and do that, because I get to enjoy, the footage that you have. That sounds terrifying to me, but, that's.
Well, and I think you touch on another good point too, Greg, and that is that, being in an alien environment, a place where we need life support equipment to survive and so forth, that can be, challenging to operate in, and confronting a potentially dangerous animal. Those are normal, healthy fears. There's nothing wrong with, I think that's a good sense of self-preservation, is to have that. But the reality is, not to be cavalier about it, but I've made thousands of dives with sharks over my career. And maybe there's been 3 or 4 times where I felt it was getting a little too dicey and had to get out of the water. But overwhelmingly, my experiences have been very positive. And again, I don't want to portray them as house pets. They're not a Labrador retriever that you're going to go up and give a hug to. But, divers safely encountered sharks all over the world. And, almost in every situation, it's a positive encounter where you just get to see this amazing animal. And I might add that you wouldn't do that same thing with other top predators. You wouldn't go to the Serengeti and jump out of the Land Rover and go nose to nose with a lion. That would be very,
Right.
very bad. But, divers do routinely encounter sharks and they get very close to them. And again, things can happen. They are unpredictable. We don't know everything about them. So you have to be very careful and experienced and, work with good people. But nonetheless, these things can be done. And I think, at a time when we are eradicating so many sharks from the Earth's oceans, and given how important the oceans are to our very existence, not only every other breath we take, but the food we eat, the commerce, the recreation, the weather, everything comes from the ocean. So taking 100 million apex predators out is a bad thing. So we need to have a new appreciation. So even if you don't want to ever see a shark in your life, I think maybe just understanding that they are important for you is good.
And hopefully, with Jaws, now at 50 versus back then, maybe over the years, people have a better understanding of that. Ideally, that
that's right.
is something that needs conserved. So
totally,
yeah, could be a benefit.
I can jump in and say that when I started diving in 1977, and then saw my first shark a few years later, most divers, as I recall, wouldn't have wanted to go with sharks back then. I think after Jaws, there were, some who went to Australia and places like that to see great white sharks in a cage. But, most divers were a little hesitant, I think, back then to encounter sharks. But today, I think it's the exact opposite. I think, there's legions of divers out there who routinely go out to see sharks, and, they've built other careers upon that, or ecotourism businesses and so forth. So it has come a long way. We've gained a different perception of them and their role in the ocean. So that in itself is a really good thing. And again, going back to that 50 years ago, seeing Jaws, it was a scary film. I mean, we have every right to be afraid when we see it, even still today. But I maintained it was a great film. It was well made. It was well written, directed. The acting was brilliant, and I think you can still watch that film and be entertained for all those reasons without making it having it make you dislike sharks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why it's still so popular. And as you mentioned, I think there's Tarantino even in this documentary talking about how, it's the
perfect
movie. The perfect movie.
Yep.
Well, Brian, thank you, for having time to talk to us about this too. I do have to ask here, since you mentioned it earlier, that you said you can't really go on a ship or a vessel anywhere without making a quote. What is your favorite quote?
Oh, I mean, everybody says we're going to need a bigger boat. Inevitably, that one will come up too. But, I'll just, every time we're on a boat, if there's, somebody grabbing the wheel, I'll say, Hooper drives the boat, chief. Or, there's just an endless supply of quotes. I do a lot of Quint quotes. When I see one of my assistant or somebody putting together all this fancy camera equipment, I'll say something like, what are you, some sort of half-assed astronaut, like Quint said, or, if we've got a shark cage, I'll always say, what is that, a portable shower or monkey cage, like Quint said. So, there's just never-ending supply of great quotable lines when you're on a boat from Jaws.
Never ending and still relevant today, 50 years later. Well,
that's right.
Brian, thank you very much, for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and everything that you do, for bringing that side of the world to everybody else and letting us
thank
be able
you
to see
very
it.
much. My pleasure. Thanks.
All right, there we go. Jaws at 50. Huge thank you to Brian for joining us for that segment. Really appreciate his time. The definitive inside story. So that is on National Geographic. You can see their stream on Disney Plus and Hulu. But great, just insight to see that effect that movie really had on so many people. And I think you're probably going to be hearing a lot about that here over the next couple of weeks as we approach the anniversary of Jaws. And thank you for joining us here on Fox 12 Now, whatever platform you're watching on. I appreciate it. I recommend the Fox 12 Oregon app is a great way to watch because you can check out everything that we do here with our show, but also everything else that goes on at Fox 12 Oregon. But regardless, thanks for finding us. Feel free to share these segments as well. Let other people know about it and get the word out there. But again, big thank you to Brian. And all right, we've got more coming up here. We're going to take a quick break. If you're watching live, I'll be back in like 10 minutes with another segment for you. So I will talk to you then. And if not, feel free to check out all of our other segments if you're watching after the fact. There's lots for you to see. I'll talk to you soon. I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now.